let's go all the way back to classical ancient Greek, the early epoch of the, you could say, what's known as the Hellenistic disciplines and sciences, going all the way back to perhaps 4 centuries before Christ. We're going back to the ancient classical epoch of the Greek civilization, in which much of what we know today, especially within the Western Hemisphere, in the Greco-Roman world, comes from the Latin or the Greek world. Much of what we have taken to be truth and to be the standard of civilization is inspired or derived from the ancient Greek and Latin world, okay? The Greco-Roman world. The systems of administration, the legal theories, the economic order, the educational theories and the educational programs, much of these have been inherited or at least inspired by the ancient Greco-Roman world. It suffices for you just to look at, for example, the White House. Just look at the White House. Look at the structure. Look at how it's been built. It's a direct replica of the Greek and Roman government buildings. Direct replica. So we're still living under the shadow of the Greco-Roman world. And many of the ideas that are held as being the most civilized, democracy, the ideas of civil rights or individual freedom of expression, many of these things come from the ancient pagan world. One of the most important and effectively understudied in the public space is the system of education. This is understudied and underemphasized. The system of education. How do you go about acquiring an education? What is education to begin with? What's an effective education? And what is the objective of education? It's very difficult because we are being instructed in most cases. The education system today, the public education system, is a form of instruction. It's just preparing you for the workforce, okay? Or to be a productive member of society, a tax-paying member of society. It is not necessarily an education system that is there to make you independent in all possible ways. So the ancient values or the ancient principle of education was to get you out of something, 𝙎𝙀𝙀𝙑𝙀𝙀, to get out of something, out of ignorance, out of bondage, out of something limited, something vast. It's got you out of something, out of a very basic way of looking at the world into something a bit more complicated, a bit more sophisticated. It got you out of something. The ancients used to speak of the liberal arts. The 7 liberal arts. Liberal, again, to liberate you from something. To liberate you or the students from ignorance, from darkness, from not knowing. To liberate them from these conjectures. To liberate them from something narrow, to bring them into the light. So the liberal arts, throughout, up until the Renaissance, was effectively the optimal way of educating individuals. And you have to understand, education in the ancient world wasn't a given right, it was a privilege. It was only restrained within the aristocracy, the clergy, and those who were wealthy and able to afford private instruction. So education was never supposed to be a public resource. It was never supposed to be for everybody in society. It was never supposed to be a right that every individual has. The liberal arts was specifically for those people who would run society, for those people who would be at the top of the pyramid, for those people who were privileged and who had the access to this knowledge. And we see it to this very day. In fact, education today is not the same as it used to be. I'm sure many of us can attest to that. It has changed. It is more indoctrination. It is more conditioning. It is more instruction than it is actually, let's liberate you and let's allow you to think critically, openly and directly. This is what liberal arts is supposed to be representative of. And to this very day, in fact, you still have colleges, universities, private schools that teach liberal arts. For those of you who are in education, as teachers and instructors, you will understand exactly what I'm saying here. It is a superior form of education. Those who take liberal arts typically are a bit more privileged in the socioeconomic realms. Upper class, okay? They are those who receive liberal arts. Now, of course, it's no longer just 7 subjects. It has been developed, is a lot broader, but the core principles and the core parameters remain the same. Liberal arts is divided into two segments. So we have the 7 arts, which includes the trivium and the quadrivium. There are 3 topics which are the foundation level that every student would have to master before moving on to the more elaborate, detailed topics, the quadrivium, the 4 topics. And this was classically the way people would be instructed and taught. Literacy, for example, when we say somebody is literate, in the modern context, it means they can read A, B, C, D, E, F, G. This is a literalistic interpretation of literalism, of literacy. A literalistic understanding is, I can read this word, I am literate. But in the ancient world, literacy did not mean just being able to read. Literacy meant being able to read, first of all, the ancient texts, especially the Bible. To be able to read sacred text, number 1. To be able to read in Latin. You have to be able to read in Latin, the sacred text. And number 3, to make interpretation of that text. Once you have these 3 components, you'll be considered a literate person. If all you could do is read the words, then you are not literate. Now, if we apply that principle or that definition of literacy in the modern world and say you have to be able to read and interpret what you've read before you can be literate, the literacy rates would be very, very low. Will be very, very, very low. And I'm going to demonstrate that today. Okay. Literacy is not just I can read the paper and I can read what the words are saying. It's actually I can read it, I can interpret it, I can break down the different devices that are being utilized here, the different rules of grammar. I can give an interpretation of what I've read. Now you're literate. Okay? And it's very important, especially for those of us who are, mashallah, tabarakallah, students of knowledge. And this is one of the reasons why, when the printing press was introduced for the first time, the ulama, the scholars, were against it. Because the literacy that people were approaching the text with was a very literalistic. Okay, I've read the hadith, it says this, and that's what it means. But you have to be literate in the greater sense of things to understand how words work, how rhetoric works, how language functions. The meanings and functions of language makes you literate. Unfortunately, we have taken the modern interpretation of literacy and applied it as if that was the only measure. But the reality is, there is always a lot more than just reading letters on a piece of paper. There's a lot more to it. Dorothy Sayers, actually, she wrote a very beautiful book, The Lost Tools of Learning. I would recommend, if you are an educator in any capacity, either you educate your children, or you're in a school, or you teach in a center, or you educate yourself, I highly recommend you take this book, The Lost Tools of Learning. It's a contemporary book, well, contemporary, relatively speaking, within the last 100 years. And it is written as a critique of the modern education system at the time. Dorothy Sayers basically says we have the most literate population in history, but at the same time we have the most stupid people in history. You only have to go to social media to really validate that statement. We have the most literate people and societies in history, but we have the most ill-informed and simple-minded people in history at the same time. How is that possible? So she goes about analyzing, explaining, looking at the different liberal arts, the different, for example, the trivium, okay, and how people are able to read and write, but at the same time are not able to decipher the meaning of words, and how education has now become really something that is detrimental rather than supposed to build the society up. It's a fantastic book. It will change how you see things, generally speaking. It's a really very, very good book. There's another book, I'll recommend it later on, a bit more advanced, but this is a very good book. So where do we begin? Let's begin with the lower half of the liberal arts. There are 7 topics. The first 3 topics are the foundation building stones for any education. Even if it is a general education, public education, it still requires the very fundamental elements for it to be effective. So in classical terms, they will talk of logic, grammar, and rhetoric. Logic being what affects the mind, right? How things actually logically, the reasoning faculty is being engaged. A logical premise leads to a logical conclusion, how to figure things out by using logical steps, inference, and so on and so forth. We're going to cover that in the next session, inshallah. Grammar is the meaning of things, the nature of things. Okay, this is a 𝙎𝙀𝙑𝙀𝙀, this is a 𝙎𝙀𝙀𝙀𝙀, this is grammar, but also the attributes of things is grammar. And rhetoric, this is the way you express ideas. This is how you communicate, whether it's written or whether it's spoken. It is the medium by which your ideas, the logical faculty, and the grammar, the knowledge you have, is conveyed onto others. It's the most important element. Okay, so all three of these things are very important. Then we move on to, so that's just the trivium. It's a lower level of the liberal arts. And typically, the student has to master these three before he can move on to the upper half. So for example, in the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun tells us that there is a medium of education that is applied in the Maghreb, in North Africa. And there's another way of education that is applied in Al-Andalus, the Iberian Peninsula. So he says in the Maghreb, the way they teach children is by beginning with memorization of Quran. They memorize Quran. That's the foundation. They begin there. You memorize Quran. Whether you understand it or not is irrelevant. You begin just by memorization. Whereas in Al-Andalus, the way they begin is by teaching language. They begin with rhetoric and grammar. And they do that by teaching poetry. So children learn poetry and they learn grammar and rhetoric. Right? And the reason why that is more effective is because you learn how the pieces work. Before you build something, you understand the blocks. Okay, what's a noun, what's a pronoun, what's an adjective, what's a simile. You begin by learning how each individual block works, what the faculties and functions are, before you begin putting things together. So Ibn Khaldun says, Al-Andalus, the children there used to learn poetry and language and grammar, sarf, nahu, before they began memorizing Quran. Because by the time they get to the Quran part, they will appreciate and understand each ayah, the terms utilized in the ayah. There's a more detailed and more in-depth appreciation for what they're learning, right? So, I mean, either side can be argued. It's better you just memorize to begin with because your memory is fresh as a child. Later on, you can get into the details. You could also say, well, actually, I'd rather you memorize one verse with proper understanding than to memorize a million ayat, but you don't understand anything. There's a balance in between. Okay, but in the classical sense of things, in the Western perspective, you begin with understanding things first before you construct ideas. You begin by understanding principles first before you construct ideas. So the trivium was basically designed to give you the building blocks. Once you've mastered that, grammar, logic, rhetoric, you can now elevate the quadrivium. These are the 4 topics which include mathematics, arithmetic, numbers, geometry, which is space, you have astronomy, and you have music. And these 4, don't understand them in the way we understand them today. So geometry, music, arithmetic is not the way you understand it. It's actually in a broader context, because all 4 of these things have patterns, have symmetry. There's a system behind it. There is order behind all of these things. And so when the person begins to understand the basic and the objective facts, grammar, rhetoric, language, or logic, you can elevate to the abstract form. So music, for example, geometry, arithmetic, there's a lot of abstract thinking happening at that level, higher level. Right? So when you combine all 7, the individual should be somebody very well grounded in knowledge, can then take on any topic they like. Any topic they like, they want to specialize in later on. Any other topic, they have the building blocks to understand anything else. They are a well-rounded individual, and they can go and take any topic afterwards and understand it. Today we have the opposite. Today we have the topic, and you introduce to the topic, and you begin being instructed in the topic. Not necessarily to give you the explanation as to the building blocks every time and the reason why this is this and that is that. It is just, this is the way it is, and we're going to teach it to you that way. So you're being instructed to do things, but not to necessarily deconstruct ideas, get to the nitty-gritty, understand the rationale behind things, and then construct your own ideas. That's the most important thing. To challenge, to question, to construct your own ideas, that you have to pay for. That's what liberal arts comes into it. Okay, so these 7, you could say, components of liberal arts, then also feed into the ancient, very high sciences. When we talk of philosophy, for example, elite theology, dialectics, epistemology, these are very high, very abstract ideas and principles that you typically will find when you talk of those who are the most intellectual classes in society. They deal at this level, they talk at this level, okay? Epistemology, dialectics, elite theology, philosophy. So rather than talking about, for example, is the pen yellow, is the pen black, they'll raise it to another level. What is a pen to begin with? What is black? Okay? What is the truth? What is a concept of a pen? Where did that come from? Okay? Are you sure it's a pen? Are you sure it's not just a piece of plastic? So you get into another level of inquiry and really challenging ideas. That's a very high level. Not everybody can reach that level, but we have to be aware that these levels exist. Now the beauty is, once you understand the principles and the core components of these sorts of ideas, especially if you're reading Quran, you open up different opportunities, different possibilities. Wonderful when you begin to appreciate. This is why, classically speaking, a scholar had to go through various stages over many years of understanding just language, just the function of language, before you can begin even trying to interpret the ayat of the Quran or the ahadith. Just the function of language was very important. When Allah created Adam, the first thing He did, He taught Adam the names of every single thing. And the tafsir is, the names means the grammar. This is an apple, that's an angel, that's the sun, this is the earth. Not just that, but also the interpretation and also the attributes of everything. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ أَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا, the attributes of every single thing. This is an apple. It is edible. It is sour. It has seeds. The seeds can be planted. That can lead to a tree growing. So the angels were really astonished because of the level of understanding Adam, this creation, had to name things and to give the interpretations and the attributes of everything. It's a skill that human beings possess. And so when you study grammar, this is the science of understanding the name of things, the attributes of things, and the dimensions of things, right? And this is taught structurally in a system of liberal arts, or the trivium. This was also taught in the madaris, the nizamiyya of the Islamic schooling system. It was also taught. We don't have it anymore, unfortunately. Islamically speaking, as I said, this is not alien to Islam. Okay, don't think this is Western ideas and this is alien to Islam. No, we have the same principles. In fact, the early scholars of Islam borrowed heavily when it comes to rhetoric and education from Aristotle. They knew him as the first teacher. That was the name they gave him during the Abbasid epoch, as the first teacher. Many of his books and principles were translated into Arabic. And so we inherited that tradition also. And it was very useful for the Muslims to codify certain sciences, certain principles. So for example, logic is known as ilm al-mantiq. It was taught, classically speaking. Grammar, sarf wa nahu. We have the very famous poem, Al-Ajrumiyyah. Okay, it was taught specifically to people studying Islam and studying in general. Rhetoric, al-khitaba, al-bayan, al-balagha. These are all forms of rhetoric that were taught classically to scholars. So the trivium is also, even within the Islamic tradition, was there and was a foundational aspect of education. We had to know these things, because it's very impossible to navigate in the world of ideas and concepts when all you have are black and white perspectives. If you are very literalistic, it's black and white for you, haqq and batil, you will not be able to transcend the very basic literary, I've read this work and it means this. You need more than just that to navigate ideas. So people were educated for several years just grammar, just logic, syllogisms and all this. They were taught, in Islamic seminaries. And I think we need it even to this very day, to be honest with you. We need it to this very day. So the liberal arts, again, it has 7 components. I would recommend for anybody who's interested to buy this book, Dorothy Sayers, The Lost Tools of Learning. Very interesting. Then we have, of these 7 liberal arts, as I said before, it is in the Quran. There are evidences for it. So for example, in Surah Ar-Rahman, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ar-Rahman, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Ar-Rahman, the most merciful, allama al-Quran, he taught Quran, khalaqa al-insan, allamahu al-bayan. Ar-Rahman, the one, the most merciful, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, allama al-Quran, he taught Quran, khalaqa al-insan, he created man, allamahu al-bayan. He taught man speech. Bayan, it means to give a speech, a clear speech, an address. It's one of the miracles of Allah that he actually mentions. He taught man how to speak, elocution, how to speak. So it's a very heavy thing. It's not a light thing. Rhetoric is very important. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says when he wants to do something, what does he say? Kun fayakun. These are words. Okay? So words are powerful. So rhetoric was taught, bayan was taught. It was a science, how to speak. It's not enough just to say the right thing. You have to say it in the right way. Bayan was taught as a science. Likewise, as I said before, I recited the ayah, Surah Al-Baqarah, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ أَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا ثُمَّ أَرْضَهُمْ عَلَى الْمَلَائِكَةِ فَقَالَ أَنْبِئُونِي بِأَسْمَاءِ هَؤُلَاءِ إِن كُنْتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. He taught Adam, the first human being, the names, and the names here means the grammatical name, as in this is an apple, that's a chair, but also the attributes of everything. He could explain, this is for sitting down on. This is for eating. This is for this. There are manafi', there are benefits of this, X, Y, and Z. He can go into detail. And that's what human beings are good at doing. We can categorize things. We can give the benefits and the harms. We can explain things. We can enumerate the benefits and the harms. So we are different to other animals and angels and creation. We're able to do these things. وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ أَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. Grammar. That's why we study sarf and nahu. Very important. And then mantiq, which is knowledge. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions a lot of times in the Quran that don't they think? Don't they ponder? The worst of creation before Allah is the one who is deaf, dumb, and doesn't think. Okay. So these are things that are inherent within Islam. And I know that there are some people who think that it's anti-Islamic. The issue of being logical, of rhetoric. These are anti-Islamic Western ideas. All we have to have is the haqq, and that's enough. You've misunderstood the message. You've misunderstood the message. In fact, we need it more than anybody else because we're interpreting the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have to pay more attention than anybody else to grammar, rhetoric, and logic because we're trying to interpret the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, yeah, Brother Sufyan, Bismillah.
Yes, I want to ask, you think this modern day madrasa system that we have in many countries where you see the kids just moving back and forth, reading the Quran is just counterproductive to this?
Not at all, quite frankly. And I will go even farther. It's obsolete.
Well, not counterproductive. What I mean is you think it's missing the point when they're just teaching the kids to do that instead of doing all this.
It depends because look, there are some madaris where the system is you begin with memorization. The logic is there. As a child, you're like a sponge. If you're going to memorize, this is the time to memorize. Okay, so memorize as much as you can. Begin with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Memorize as much as you can. And if you remain on the path of knowledge, when you graduate, you'll go into the higher levels. Now you can get into interpretation, understanding. For those people who stick the course and are able to memorize and then go on to understanding, perfect. But for those who just stop at memorization, it's counterproductive. Yeah, there's no shortage of people who know the Quran by heart. But if you tell them, give me the interpretation of Qul huwallahu ahad, or just translate it for me, some may have a difficulty in doing that. Hafiz Quran, but what he's reciting doesn't understand any of it, or very hardly can understand what he's saying. That is counterproductive because, yes, there's barakah in memorizing, certainly. But it's greater barakah in understanding and interpreting and being able to implement what you've memorized. Not like what Allah says in the Quran, you are like donkeys carrying books. You have all this knowledge, you cannot interpret any of it, or you can't even apply any of it because you don't understand any of it. So just memorizing is obsolete today. Why? Because if you want to search for an ayah in this day and age, this can find an ayah for you in a split second. Okay, you no longer have to go and open the Quran or ask somebody who's a hafiz, that ayah, where is it? You can search it here. So recalling information is not really the most important thing right now. What's important now is interpreting, understanding it properly. Okay, the proper understanding of things. That's the more important thing in the age we live in right now. That is what makes a difference between an educated person and somebody who just knows the words or just knows the information. Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, was once in a company of muhaddith. The muhaddith memorized a hadith. Abu Hanifa, although some people claim he didn't know many ahadith, that's not the point. I don't believe that, but that's something people actually allege against him. He was in a company of the muhaddith, and a woman came. She had a question pertaining to the deen. So she asked the question. The muhaddith gave a hadith relevant to the question, but he couldn't give her fatwa. So he said, okay, qala, and then he began to tell the hadith. But that didn't answer the question. He just gave a hadith related to the question she had. Abu Hanifa listened and he gave a fatwa. Although he didn't know the hadith before he heard the hadith from the muhaddith. But he listened to what the muhaddith said and he made istinbat to be able to give the fatwa. So the muhaddith explains to him, how did you get the answer? Right? Because it's not just understanding the words and memorizing them, it's about understanding the meaning of these words and how they work, the function, and how to extract meaning from these words, istinbat. So again, just memorizing is good if you're going to go on and further develop your understanding to actually get to the meat of the matter later on. But if it's just a matter of memorizing, there are many people who memorized the entire Quran. And if you sat down with them and wanted to have a real discussion about this ayah or this verse or this meaning, they couldn't do that for you because they don't understand the meaning of what they memorized. So it depends. Again, I know some of the Alimiyyah programs, you do have to be a hafiz, but they teach you as well. You're going to learn the language, you learn the grammar, you learn the rules, and you learn the fiqh behind it. No problem. Yeah. It's
It also makes sense what you said about Abu Hanifa, because oftentimes there's a lot of criticism towards him because he used too much logic, and I've heard that from many people.
They don't understand.
About he didn't have hadiths, that he didn't live during the hadith, he didn't live during that time, he was ignorant.
This is a sign of foolishness. I'm sorry, pardon my language. It's a sign of foolish and confident foolishness. Abu Hanifa was at the time when there were great muhaddithun. Imam Malik was a contemporary of his, and they would be in correspondence. He would actually visit Medina and sit with Imam Malik. And Imam Malik, being the muhaddith he is and he was, attested to his knowledge. He said that man sitting there, had he wished, he could prove the pillar to be made of gold. He never criticized Abu Hanifa for lack of hadith knowledge. Later on, you have Imam al-Shafi'i, rahimahullah, who was a muhaddith, but also very logical and very, from that perspective, very good at that. And the muhaddithun of his age would say to him, they complained, why is it that you always have the answer to questions that we don't have the answers to? Why is it that when a question comes, a mas'ala comes, you have the answer, but we all have the same Quran, we all have the same hadith, we have access to the same thing, but you have the answer? He explained to them that there's a process by which you can derive meaning from these words. It's not just a matter of memorizing them. There's a process behind, there's a science, a discipline, a system by which to use what you've memorized to derive meanings. And so they asked him, please write it down. So he wrote Then he wrote Al-Risala. These two books are foundations of fiqh, how to derive meaning from a hadith and Quran, istinbat. That was more important, really, because they had no shortage of people who memorized a hadith and Quran in that day and age. What was astonishing was how did this man manage every single time to give us amazing insights and wonderful meanings. He said there's a system behind it. And it's not just about memorizing, it's about understanding the principles. For example, somebody who's an Arab and who speaks Fusha Arabiya, proper Arabic, classical Arabic, she may not be a hafidha, she may not have memorized Quran by heart, but if she understands the rules of grammar, she can correct somebody who's a hafidh. She can correct somebody who's a hafidh, although she hasn't memorized the whole Quran. Why? Because she understands how the language works. Mathalan, somebody may say, I remember once I was in Taraweeh. The ayah was, subhanAllah, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةً وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةً وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةً. And the Qari, who wasn't an Arab speaking, he didn't speak Arabic, because of the way the maqamat and how beautiful the recitation was, he ended the ayah with وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَاتٍ. Say, subhanallah. That's not the intention of the meaning. Somebody who speaks Arabic would straight away, this is not what Allah meant. Daraja and darajat, there's a huge difference. It may sound nice, وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَاتٍ, but that is not what the ayah says. And the interpretation makes it very clear. Daraja, between men and women, is one level of distinction. But darajat means levels of distinction. Way different from levels above. Allah said only one level, because they spend on their women and they look after them. Right? So you don't have to be a hafidh in that instance to understand this went left very quickly. So the importance of understanding is very, very key. Is very, very key. You know, you have people who say, for example, I've read Bukhari cover to cover. Okay, does that mean you understood everything in Bukhari? You do realize one hadith in Bukhari has been discussed for the last 1400 years. Just because you read it doesn't mean you understood it. Look at the interpretations behind these things. The meanings are more important in some cases than the actual words. You know, there's an ayah in Surah Ali Imran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, nobody knows the meaning of these when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about, for example, the muhkamat and mutashabihat ayat. Those ayat that are very clear, hunna ummul kitab. These ayats are very clear cut, qata'i. Yeah, very clear. These are the majority of the book. Then he says, wal mutashabihat, those verses that are ambiguous. They can have one or two meanings. No, they have to have more than two meanings. Definition, more than two meanings. Mutashabihat. Allah says, those whose hearts have deviation seek to go that direction. Then he says, nobody knows except him. Nobody knows the meaning except him, Allah. وَالرَّاسِخُونَ فِي الْعِلْمِ يَقُولُونَ آمَنَّا بِهِ. That one ayah is a miracle. I'm not going to go into it, but you can memorize it if you like. But if you understood what that one ayah meant and the difference of opinion from that same one ayah, it's such a miracle, so vast. So we need to understand the function of language. If you look at, for example, from a grammatical perspective only, from a grammatical perspective, some of the ayat and the way they have been, the dots, the awqaf in the Quran, very clear. There are certain ayat, for those of you who are, mashallah, memorize Quran, you know, if I stop here, I'm not allowed to stop here. One word later, I can't stop there. If I don't stop here, I must stop there. Why are these rules there? Because the meanings change. It's not a matter of just memorizing it and doing what you like with it. There are rules in place, and if you stop a word before or a word later, the meanings change. So now we have to look into meanings, not just the words. Okay, so it's very, very important. These are very important things, and oftentimes, if we don't pay attention to that and we just want to look at the surface level, the ayah said this, and you just take that for what it is, you can be misled. You can be misled and misguided, and misguide others. May Allah save us from that. So the liberal arts, really, we cannot go into it. This will take a long time. But I promise that the logic aspect we will talk into, inshallah, in the next session. And today we're going to focus entirely on rhetoric. Very important. Very important. Some of the Anbiya who were very gifted, rhetorically speaking, are Sayyidina Dawood, Sayyidina Shu'aib, and Sayyidina Harun. These three prophets were gifted rhetorically. Very, very well spoken. So it is an important aspect of our religion as well, that we know how to speak properly. It's the most accessible form of convincing people to do something. You use sentiments. It can be inspiring them with fear, with hope, with sometimes humor is a form of winning people over. People study this, especially marketeers. They study these things to a great detail, so they can utilize it again to get their market share. It's very powerful stuff. Yeah. So pathos, logos, ethos. All three of them are very important.
If that's a form of pathos, like when people are protesting, is that mostly pathos you would say?
Good question. What would you say? What would you say?
It seems more like pathos because people are highly emotional.
Absolutely,
and
yeah.
They bring the pictures out. Some pictures might be like factual pictures, like, you know, like a factual statistic to use ethos. So
yeah, pathos, as I said, this is the most accessible. It's the most accessible. It's the most popular form because people are emotional, mostly. That's the easiest way to gather people, the masses, is by pathos. Yeah. Which is why you find, for example, if you Google recitations of Quran, you find oftentimes the best performing videos are those that have a tag, emotional, will make you cry. Yeah. Or they have a picture of an imam weeping. So people are naturally drawn to that more than a recitation based on the proper breathing techniques, the proper enunciation. That doesn't draw as many people as the one that draws the emotions. Whether they understand the ayah or not, it's the emotions that drives actions. Marketeers understand this very well, which is why they play on emotions all the time. I studied in business school, very detailed, really very detailed case studies, how to extrapolate these sciences and to utilize it for marketing. And it's mind-blowing stuff. Wallahi, they have studies upon studies how to manipulate. For example, I'll give you a few insights. When I was studying this, our instructor said to us that this is dangerous information. Dangerous information, right? But they study it. Colors. McDonald's, for example, red and yellow, they've studied colors. They said yellow and red inspires hunger. That's why Coca-Cola is red. McDonald's is red and yellow. Burger King is red. Pizza Hut is red and white. Look at many of these massive franchises, fast food franchises. Red is something that evokes appetite and hunger. They study it. Nothing's by accident. Right? Likewise, music. When you enter the supermarkets, and music, by the way, is one of the most powerful forms and mediums of manipulating emotions. Al-Farabi wrote a book, Kitab al-Musiq, the book of music, in which he writes the theories and the melodies that will make people go to sleep or cry or laugh, literally. There are many studies. You know, just yesterday, I came across a video, randomly, of musical notes and sounds. They hook up a speaker to an instrument and they put salt or sand on the speaker. There's a little kind of a platform. For those in science who study science who probably know of these experiments. And you put a thin plate on top of the speaker which absorbs the vibrations. Then on top of that plate you put sand or you put grains of salt, evenly spread. Then you begin to play the instrument, note by note, and wallahi, perfect patterns emerge. Perfect geometric patterns emerge with every different note, different pitches and different resonance. You have different perfect patterns emerge. It's mind-boggling. And if you can Google it, you can write visible sound. Google visible sound or sound made visible. And there are many people playing the same instruments in different ways of doing it. And every time you get different patterns. It's a miracle. But it's also a powerful medium. Sounds are very, very powerful, very evocative. And so the emotions are utilized as a means of making people hungry or sad or angry. You find, for example, in one of these studies, they talk of grazing. In marketing terms, grazing, right? So grazing is effectively when a person enters a supermarket. This is why you find in most of the major brands and supermarkets, there's music in the background. They've studied that if you have music in the background, the customer is more likely to graze. That means rather than looking for an item and going away, they're more likely to stick around and to look to graze, okay? And that increases the potential of buying something eventually. So you graze when the music is in the background. Something subconsciously puts you in a trance where you're not necessarily paying attention, you're just grazing, okay? And they want to prolong that grazing for the longest possible period. Likewise, and again, these were actual case studies at postgraduate level. This is how you get people to buy things. They would, for example, take a massive supermarket. Pay attention next time if you're in the UK, Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury's. The mega stores, not the small stores, the mega stores. And the design was the entrance is at one end of the supermarket and the exit on the other end, a distance. And the reason why that was done is because if you have entrance and exit in the same place, it makes the grazing shorter, right? But what they did was they made sure that for you to exit, you have to go across various aisles in order to exit, which again lengthens how long you stay in the store and what you get to see in the store, right? Likewise, again, many examples of this. Rather than putting everyday items up front, for example, milk, butter, and bread up front, they'll put it somewhere at the back. And what they put up front are the things that are not essential. Clothing, for example, decorations. Because in order for you to get what you need, you have to go across what you don't need. And that again increases the likelihood of what? Finding more items to pick up. And at the very end, when you're going to pay for your items, you have more items there, chewing gums, sweeties. It's a final opportunity. So every step you take on that journey has been planned. Somebody sat down and planned the psychological journey. If I go across from this aisle to that aisle and the music playing in the background, all of that has a psychological impact on you. The fact that you have bakeries in store, you can smell the items. All of that is pre-planned and prepared for your journey through that store. Okay? So sentiments are very, very powerful, extremely powerful, and it's something that we cannot underestimate. In fact, the Quran, we'll get into it later, inshallah. Allah talks of when shaitan says to Allah, I'm going to misguide them. Allah says, فَاسْتَعْزِزْ. Misguide them, entice them with your voice. And the scholars of tafsir say this voice is music. It's a powerful medium, right? It's a powerful medium. There are many studies out there, the different beats and the ranges and the loops, they all have impact. So yes, it's not surprising that you find most people are driven by sentiments. So mass riots and mass demonstrations is not based always on logic or even credibility, because we've seen not so long ago in America, Black Lives Matter, across the world in fact. That was not a logical or an ethical or a credible movement. We've only realized later on it was actually a scam, right? Because the sentiments drove the movement, not to sit down and think the people behind it, are they credible people? Do they have a track record of doing this? Who are they to begin with, right? People didn't ask those questions. They just went with the flow. So the sentiments are very, very easily exploited. And unfortunately, most people go by sentiments before they begin to ask questions. And somebody who's unscrupulous will exploit that. This is why you find people who are demagogues, racists, xenophobes. They utilize sentiments, fear of loss. You are going to be impoverished. These people are taking your country, you're taking your land, they're taking your rights, they're creeping Sharia. All of these to inspire fear. Shaitan said to Adam and Eve, do you want to die? Do you want to be poor? Do you want to suffer? If you don't want to suffer and be poor and die, eat from the tree of knowledge. You'll be invincible, you'll be eternal. So he played on the emotions. They never asked him, who are you? Ethos, who are you? first of all. What's your name? Where did you come from? Why should we even believe you? Or what the logic behind it? Why would Allah put a tree here, give us everything we need, and then deceive us? Na'udhu billahi min dhalik. Logic, right? They went with the emotions. Fear of death drove them to eating the tree, right? So it's very powerful stuff, very important things for us to understand. On the note of madaris, I think that to an extent, okay, this is another one. Cosmetic stores, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's important to keep this in mind because all of us, whether we like it or not, we are targeted by this. Even jingles, you know, even brand names. There are books written and science, there's a science to these things. You know, for example, brand names, they should have no more than 3 subhanallah, 3 syllables. They study it. Brand names that have more than 4 syllables, more than 3 syllables perform less than those that have 3 syllables. Right? They have to have a certain ring to it. There are certain things that they program so that the subconscious mind is activated when they hear these things. So these jingles that you hear, you know, you think it's not just because it sounds nice. Somebody sat down and designed that jingle or that specific advert on purpose with every second matters in that advert. Nothing was done haphazardly. Everything was put in place so that it has maximum impact on your subconscious mind. Right? And many of these things, by the way, they experiment on prisoner populations. So there are some prisons in the US, for example, where they paint everything pink and they make the prisoners wear pink. Right? There's a reason why they chose that color. They know that green, for example, has been proven to bring peace and calm. The color green brings peace and calm, right? But other colors evoke other things. And so these are all things that are to manipulate their sentiments. And it's important because, again, these are tools. Okay.
Welcome to HistoryUn, the world's leading online learning platform specializing in Islamic history. Discover the HistoryUn mobile app and participate in regular live and interactive seminars and tune in directly from your handset from anywhere in the world. Enjoy instant access to a growing catalog of on-demand streaming content exclusive to the platform, accessible from a variety of devices including desktops, tablets, and cell phones. Connect instantly with our global community of history enthusiasts via our private community forum. To find out more about our online history programs and resources, visit our website today at www.historyun.com.